zoom over to Marin County with Judy Stalker. And Judy is a wetland biologist and has served on the board of the Marin Audubon Society for 22 years. Established 70 years ago, Marin Audubon has focused on preserving and restoring native wetland and associated upland habitat in Marin County for the benefit of birds and other wildlife. Marin Audubon currently owns and manages over 500 acres of varying sized properties from Mill Valley to the Marin-Sonoma border. All right, I'll pass it to you, Judy.
Okay, thank you. That was a good introduction of Marin Audubon and myself, so we can go to the next slide. And I just want to talk about one of our properties today is called Bahia, and it's up adjacent to the Petaluma River. So on this map, it's right above where it says Black Point, Green Point, just into the Petaluma River. Next slide. And Bahia is actually a huge area that's about 630 acres. And after a lot of opposing continued development there, Marin Audubon was able to acquire it and purchase it in 2003. And the whole property is what you see on the left, the West Bahia, Central Bahia, which were historic tidelands. And then they were restored back in, historic tidelands, and then they were turned levees were put up and they were turned into grazing land. And then when Marin Audubon acquired the property, we managed the restoration, which was all designed by Philip Williams and Associates PWA, which incorporated into ESA. But we donated the Western and Central Bahia properties after the restoration to the Wildlife Conservation Board on behalf of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The oak woodlands that are right above that land, there's about 200 acres up there. We donated to the Marin County Open Space District. And then we hung on to East Bahia, which if you look at the map on the right-hand side, you see there's these three fingers or peninsulas around a man-made lagoon. And those peninsulas are obviously man-made too. And those were designed to be streets with houses on them. A continuation of the neighborhood that you see down in the bottom left-hand corner. So the restoration plan for there that we managed and are still still managing was also designed by PWA, and it was intended to bring as much as possible back down to tidal level to benefit the listed species of the tidal marsh, which included the ridgeways, California ridgeways rail, and the salt marsh harvest mouse, and the black rail, and the San Pablo Bay song sparrow, among others. So the neighborhood there owns the lagoon. Marin Audubon doesn't own the lagoon, so we couldn't bring the whole thing just right back down to tidal action. So the restoration plan was pretty creative in bringing part of that western peninsula back down to tidal marsh, and then part of the eastern peninsula back down to tidal marsh, and then with a very gently sloping embankment from the top of the levee down to those new marshes. And then the central peninsula, the plan is to make that a oak savanna habitat with native grasses, oak trees, and seasonal pools designed into that. So you can go to the next slide. And this just shows on the top what it looked like before the restoration, just grazing land that became sort of fallow, weedy area. And then it was breached in 2008. And then you can see below what it looked like when the tidal waters were allowed to return. And then over several years, that tidal water brought in sediment that raised the elevation that allowed the seeds in the water. The native wetland seeds are right there in the water. So if you get the elevations in the channels right, then next slide, please. Then you get a very nice tidal marsh over time. And that's what we have now. This is from about a week ago. So next slide, please. So I just want to show you, this is on that eastern Bahia. standing on the Western Peninsula. And I know this is all confusing, but in the far background, you see a lot of water. That's where it was restored back into tidal action. And then that's the property that's Fish and Wildlife now. And then if you come a little more towards us, you see the strip of brown vegetation where the just right in the middle of the pickleweed. That's the extent of where the original levee went. So you can see that between there and the embankment, there's new marsh, and so that was all excavated and channels were built into it. And this is an older picture, so you can see the pickleweed getting established. Some of the mudflat is will be tidal marsh vegetation, but again, this all happens naturally once you create the right conditions. And you also see the embankment is very, very gently sloping. It's not like a quick steep rise like a lot of levees are, and that was designed into this whole project. So next slide, please. Peter Bay wrote our vegetation management plan, and I think this illustration is from a draft and not exactly how it ended up, but this shows very nicely the channels that were constructed into the western and eastern new marsh areas that were excavated. It also shows the green line, and up above that is that gently sloping embankment. And then the central peninsula, the one in the middle, the yellow shows seasonal ponding. And then those are within an area of native grasses and oak trees, more good habitat. So next slide, please. Um, the plan that Peter wrote was intended to just cover the eastern and western peninsulas on the embankments with the creeping wild rye, sort of a whole sea of creeping wild rye, and then that is a great sod forming perennial plant that really does creep, really does spread quite a bit, and so and it's relatively high, so it makes good cover habitat for the listed and other wildlife species, especially when the tide is high and they need to come up out of the marsh. Um, Before we were able to get all of the creeping wild rye planted, we hydroseeded with a non-native Italian rye because it's very fast growing. There was already plenty of it in the area. We weren't introducing something that wasn't already there. And it's not a noxious weed. And the creeping wild rye, when established, will outcompete the Italian rye. So it was just a way to hold down the fort until we could establish the creeping wild rye. So Peter found a good source, and we had the nursery beds constructed. They're lined, and we grew a lot of the rhizomes that he talked about before. You can see it up in the top left-hand corner. We planted segments of rhizomes all along both of those levees with hundreds of volunteers. And next slide. You can go to the next slide. Um, we also have had a lot of contract crews do a lot of the planting, and we do use contract crews in a lot of our bigger projects. And we also, other than those nursery beds for the creeping wild rye, the Elymus, we do use the watershed nursery grows our plants in containers for a lot of other parts of the property that we use. So we use both methods. We have used. Next slide. So on top of that sea of Elymus triticioides, in the plan were these thicket areas that were scattered areas along those levee banks of scrub plants and forbs, and we did plant those. The soil was really high in clay, very dry. We didn't have good success, and we hired the Watershed Nursery to do the same, to come and plant. They planted 12 plants per plot. They amended the soil. They They did mulching. They put three dry waters, if you remember dry waters. They put three in each plant, and that which is a lot. And then we kept an eye on it and kept replenishing the dry water when needed. And they lasted for a few years, but then they mostly fizzled out. So, um, next slide. This just shows some remnants of those thicket areas. You can see on the top right a stand of marsh baccharis, and then down below is some coyote brush, and to the left of that is some aster. And so there are still some of those plants out there. Next slide. The Western Peninsula, there's again more thicket plants, sage, California sage, coyote brush, coast live oak, and elderberry top right. And then there's some good establishment of coast live oaks along the top of that levee. Next slide. Ambrosia is a plant that really surprised us, and it's not as tall as, say, Elamis would be, but it is still good cover for smaller animals and really good food source for the seeds are for birds and insects. And it's really spreading out quite a ways along the Western Peninsula. So that's a good one. If you have disturbed soils or drought conditions, or you can't get to it very often to water, I would try ambrosia. Okay, next slide. This just shows on the top left the marsh, the Western Peninsula marsh that is still establishing about 10 years ago. And then on the bottom is showing just from last week how that pickleweed has established and it's actually climbing up that gently sloping levee. So with sea level rise, we're going to see more and more of that migrating of the marsh vegetation. So that element of a very gently sloping levee is actually a really good feature and something that will be really beneficial for dealing with sea level rise. Next slide. So on our central peninsula, where we put more of our focus after the plants weren't doing really well on the other peninsulas, and we decided to give that the soils more time. Are the creeping wild rye and Carex pragracillus, a field sedge, which was recommended as well by Peter, are doing really well. They're planted from um, container grown. They're actually spreading out so much that we're needing less of it than we thought. Been planting it out there for about 10 years, about 1,000 plants per year. Next slide. And then straw, who you'll hear from Leah about straw in a minute. They've done a lot of plantings out on our Eastern Peninsula. For a couple of years, they brought students. They amended the soil with compost. They did mulching. They did lots of watering. Their staff really maintained it. And so there's more diversity in their plantings further up the levee. But I wanted to show this one to show that the Elamis, the light brown further down, is doing well. The shrubs, the California sage and the marsh or the baccharis, the coyote brush, are doing really well there. So these two things really have really encouraged us to think that we can start trying again to really vegetate those levees. Maybe the soils are better. Next slide. Big challenge has been invasive plants. When you're not able to completely cover the whole site with natives right in the beginning, which would have been crazy expensive. And we are an all volunteer organization, so we couldn't do that. We replaced the areas of radish, realizing we don't want to spend the next 20 years always going after radish. So we replaced them with coyote brush, California sage, some euthymia, goldenrod, and that's working really well. They have taken over that area down in the bottom right hand, you can see. And then harding, oh yeah, it's okay. Next slide. You can see harding grass has come in and that spreads like wildfire. We have a lot of volunteers digging. We have crews weed whacking. You can go to the next slide. We've done a lot of sheet mulching, mow down the harding grass, put down the cardboard, the wood chips, and then a year or two later, after it's deteriorated a little, you can plant the Elamis triticioides. And so we have a lot of patches of Elamis in sheet mulching, and that's worked really well to replace the harding grass. We've also dealt with the Trichia graveolens stinkwort we got it right away. We had a biologist from San Pablo Baylands tell us, she saw it and said, get rid of that right away. You don't want that spreading. And she was right. Every year we get a little bit and we know where it is, so we go after it. So we haven't had a huge invasion of that. And this is my final slide. I just want to say that one of the key things to all of this has been patience and persistence, just staying with it. And this is a young volunteer who came out about 17 years ago with his mother. His name's Alex, and his mother is Aviva Rossi, who some of you know. And they were planting acorns right when it was newly restored. You could see there's nothing behind him. They came out last year, and we took a photo of him in the same location. And you can see how he's grown up. He's at Humboldt State now studying conservation, and the marsh has really established well there. So I think it's really key on top of the work that we're doing, the stewardship work. I think it's really key to keep bringing in people, especially young people, to expose them and educate them, and then really encourage them to want to help this, to take it to the next step and continue stewarding. So that's it. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.